with this building infrastructure. It's all on you, Paul.
So can everybody hear me? Okay, awesome. So first, I just want to quickly thank Shannon for introducing me. I also wanted to thank everybody involved in putting on this event, which has obviously had an amazing and unprecedented turnout, and which I think is a game changer for community literacy going forward. In particular, I wanted to thank Veronica for envisioning this and making it happen, and also for inviting me here. Thank you very much for that. So, today I had planned to tell you all a story. It is my own origin story as a community literacy practitioner, and it would be sprinkled with flashes of self-deprecating humor. This story would highlight a lifelong tension, what my friend Rob Cosgrove calls being a frustrated idealist, which both inspired in me a desire to be a justice-oriented scholar and considerable anxiety about whether it is possible to be a justice-oriented scholar. This tension has manifested itself in peripatetic ways, as I have both wanted to immerse myself in the people and work of situated communities, and to be a journeyman scholar-citizen, roaming from project to project and location to location. I was going to emphasize that because of my own aversion to strategic thinking, my professional and civic development has depended on tactical serendipities. And that's especially true of my encounters with mentors, many of whom are part of this conference. Without these vital, if unstructured, networks of mentorship, I could not have written my dissertation, I could not have positioned myself as a community literacy practitioner on the job market, I could not have written and published the book that I needed to obtain tenure, and I certainly would not have been invited to give this talk today. At so many moments along the way, my path to this conference would have been blocked had I not met certain really awesome people at just the right time. But as they say, sometimes it's better to be lucky than good. And in drawing lessons from this narrative, I wanted to pose the following question. Are practitioners of community literacy better off relying on beautifully tactical but highly unpredictable encounters with serendipity, which after all means pleasant surprise? Or should we transform these networks into something less sublime, but potentially more reliable and strategic? In other words, something like an institution. And because of my own ambivalence about institutions and how they impact our work, I plan to conclude this talk not by trying to answer the question myself, but by further complicating it. That is, I was going to present a whole other list of logistical, ethical, and existential questions about the nature of community literacy, and then declare that it's your job to answer them. But I kept thinking, you've probably seen these questions 1,000 times. And I know that because I've seen them 1,000 times at conference presentations and workshops. Of course, there are important differences in our origin stories and the implications we draw from them. But there is an almost Joseph Campbell-esque mythos about our field's anxieties with concepts like sustainability, institutions, models, replicability, benefits, and even terms like success and failure. These questions demonstrate our affinity for jumping right into Peter Elbow's doubting game before giving ourselves a chance to play the believing game. So let's face it, community literacy does operate amid core tensions and even contradictions, in that practitioners embrace values such as inclusivity, diversity, egalitarianism, and reciprocity, while we work for institutions that are defined by exclusivity, hierarchy, and a fair amount of conformity. And to some extent, we probably do end up reinforcing the status quo of the same injustices that drive us to this work in the first place. However, while conference discussions about internal and external disquiet are often cathartic, and while they often make me feel an enhanced sense of camaraderie with colleagues, they rarely extend beyond the articulation of our anxieties. And to me, the perspective, why are we doing this work if it doesn't make any difference anyway, is somewhat disingenuous. Because the reality is, we all have decided that this work matters and that we're going to persevere with it, despite the very real contradictions that we and our community partners face. So I don't mean to say that we shouldn't be asking critical questions, because obviously we must ask them. But I wonder if we can redirect these questions. And instead of focusing on what it is we find problematic about present circumstances, what if we spent our time at this conference envisioning what we want things to look like in the future? In other words, what if we all played the believing game together and saved the doubting game for another time? What might this look like? And this question I will try to answer. In doing so, I want to offer some lessons from an experience I had last spring at my home institution, Florida International University. My colleague, Mike Creedon, and I had agreed to facilitate a 2-day workshop for full-time faculty in the writing program. And early in the planning process, he and I resolved to design a workshop that we ourselves would actually want to attend, even if we weren't getting paid for it. The exigence for this workshop was the state of Florida's new performance metrics for university funding, which have forced FIU to put a lot of resources into student retention. Not so much because it's the moral thing to do, but because they don't want to lose their state funding. But for me, retention is a moral issue, particularly at a Hispanic-serving institution where 50% of the students are the first in their family to attend college. But the literature on retention is often fairly pessimistic, and as Pegeen Reichert-Powell writes in her book Retention and Resistance, it is often beyond the power of faculty and universities to prevent students from dropping out. And I myself had explored this issue from a variety of angles, including student dispositions toward learning and the potential impact of stereotype threat, which causes people to underperform in domains for which their identity group has been negatively stereotyped. And I do think these factors are important and they are interesting, but they operate from the default premise that retention is a problem that needs to be solved. Whereas Mike and I decided that immersing a group of faculty who are already burnt out from having just submitted spring semester grades in 2 full days of workshop about the problem of retention was not going to meet our standard of a workshop that we wanted to attend. So at this time, Mike introduced me to the concept of appreciative inquiry, a process by which people create organizational change by identifying and building on their collective strengths. Appreciative inquiry, or AI, originates from the field of change management and is most often associated with the corporate sector. With his solid professional background in technical writing, Mike is more willing to glean ideas from the corporate world than I usually am. But though I was initially skeptical, I must say that I was amazed by the results. So, beginning with assets rather than deficits, appreciative inquiry takes a positive approach to creating change within organizations. It begins with discovery, a process of storytelling in which people share what makes them most inspired and energized about their organization. Something rather different than the story I originally planned to tell you today. This is followed by the dream phase, during which people articulate common aspirations and envision what an organization that maximized people's engagement would look like. The design and deliver phases involve creating action plans and then going about the work of implementing them. And that is when utopian thinking reconnects with practical reality. Our 2-day workshop did not give us time to practice a full model of appreciative inquiry, a recursive process that can extend over weeks or months. As facilitators, Mike and I were more interested in a very specific goal: shifting the dynamics of academic discourse away from zeroing in on weaknesses and problems that must be solved, and toward zeroing in on strengths and assets from which we can build. In other words, shifting from the doubting game to the believing game. And even this modest shift, I suggest, had profound consequences for our discussions about retention. Instead of commiserating over stubborn obstacles, we spent our time discovering what it is that our program is already doing well and how we can build on these strengths, in particular by enhancing the experiences all first-year students have, whether or not they are in serious jeopardy of dropping out. we shared stories about when we are at our best and how we can maximize these experiences for ourselves and our students. And at 5 p.m. on Friday, after 2 8-hour days, our colleagues were right there with Mike and me, engaged, discovering, dreaming, designing, not looking at their phones, not yawning. So to be sure, problems related to retention, which are of course related to larger structural and material conditions in higher education and the broader society, did not suddenly disappear. But the workshop fostered a renewed spirit of energy about our capacity to enhance the experiences of faculty and students in first-year writing courses. And I believe this spirit has sustained itself into the fall term. So for me, this experience represented proof of concept, and it seemed worth trying on a larger scale. So the deep think tank on community literacy that we're having tomorrow is going to employ an abbreviated version of AI. But I also want to propose building on our strengths as a guiding theme for this whole conference. So instead of indulging it, I want to temporarily disavow my frustrated idealism and offer an alternate title for the remainder of this talk. So full disclosure, I was concerned that throwing out your title may be an academic cliche, and a colleague of mine who read this talk assured me that it is in fact the oldest trick in the conference book. So in asking you to engage in unconventional academic discourse, I ended up relying on a fairly conventional academic move. But those are the contradictions that we face in community literacy. She also pointed out that it doesn't usually take people 10 minutes to justify throwing out their title. So that part, I would say, is unconventional. Nevertheless, at the risk of veering into TED Talk territory, I want to cultivate an atmosphere of discovery and dreaming that I hope will sustain itself beyond the 30 minutes I have for this talk, circulating its way through the tent, moving into the corridors and rooms of the conference, and extending outside as conversations begun here spill out into Boulder's streets, mountains, trails, restaurants, bars, and cafes over the next 3 days. The theme of our conference is building engaged infrastructure. So I propose this. Before we start complicating, critiquing, and problematizing engaged infrastructure, in other words, playing the doubting game, let's collectively play the believing game. And in light of time constraints, I'm most interested in the first two phases of appreciative inquiry. So let us discover, or perhaps rediscover, what it is that draws us to community literacy, despite there being many rational reasons to postpone such projects or to avoid them altogether. And let's dream about what building engaged infrastructure could mean if we didn't have to worry about all the constraints that prevent our visions from becoming reality. In my remaining time, I want to launch into this process, and to provide some context, I'm going to jump into the dream phase before I step back to discover a different origin story. So I want now to direct your attention to a middle school in Brooklyn with a nondescript name. If any of you are familiar with the Paul Tough book, How Children Succeed, or the documentary Brooklyn Castle, then you will have been introduced to the amazing and quirky personalities of this school. Their chess club has received national attention for having the most successful middle school chess program in the country. But these astonishing triumphs are not really what interests me here. What I find inspiring about the club is that the players have devoted themselves to their intrinsic motivations. In other words, those things that we do simply because we love to do them. The students are so absorbed in the process of mastering the game that they regularly experience flow. As some of you may know, flow is that condition of being so absorbed in what you're doing that time and space outside that activity fall away. And it enables higher levels of performance than we are capable of achieving outside that mental state. But when it comes to explaining flow, I think it is better to describe the experience than to offer a clinical definition. So here is scholar Mihai Csikszentmihalyi explaining how his research team settled on the term. The following words from a poet and rock climber apply to all the thousands of interviews collected by us and by others over the years. The mystique of rock climbing is climbing. You get to the top of a rock glad it's over, but really wish it would go on forever. The justification of climbing is climbing, like the justification of poetry is writing. The purpose of the flow is to keep on flowing, not looking for a peak or utopia, but staying in the flow. There is no possible reason for climbing except the climbing itself. It is a self-communication. So I cannot possibly improve on that explanation. But what I find so awesome is that the students, their teacher, Elizabeth Spiegel, and their various supporters have transformed the chess program into what I like to think of as a flow cultivation milieu. In considering this concept, I want to focus on 3 characteristics that seem particularly important, though I don't mean them to be exhaustive. And by the way, my use of the word milieu was inspired by the term restorative milieu, a concept associated with the International Institute for Restorative Practices. As discussed in Ted Wachtel's book, Dreaming of a New Reality, building a restorative milieu in schools means rejecting the dominant behaviorism of mainstream formal education in America. As he puts it, a restorative milieu is about doing things with people rather than to them or for them. So one key factor of a flow cultivation milieu is self-determination. The students, for example, freely devote their weekdays and weekends to better understanding the game, which includes participating in other local clubs, studying the games of grandmasters, and examining their mistakes rigorously. Of course, the students want to win, but as with the poet rock climber, perhaps for them the ideal match is the one that never ends. As discussed by Richard Ryan and Edward Dacey, this combination of exercising autonomy, pursuing competence or mastery, and feeling connectedness with others constitutes self-determination theory, which is their explanation for why intrinsically motivated people tend to outperform extrinsically motivated people on creative tasks. For her part, the teacher, Elizabeth Spiegel, follows the precepts of what has elsewhere been called wise feedback. Wise feedback is a practice that in other contexts has shown promise in combating the effects of stereotype threat. Specifically, she maintains high expectations of every student in the club. She conveys the message that all of them are capable of achieving those expectations, and she provides rigorous feedback so they have concrete guidance for following that path. For Spiegel, every match, whether won or lost, is a teachable moment, a chance to reflect on alternate moves and the different outcomes they might have produced. And I think this form of feedback is highly flow-friendly because it helps students focus more on process and understanding and not to worry so much about winning and losing. I would add that Spiegel's relationship with her students extends beyond feedback to what we might think of as wise mentorship. She is a reliable and ongoing presence in their lives, facilitating success beyond their time in the club. And within this mentorship framework, the outcomes of individual matches is almost irrelevant. And the larger community helps sustain the club despite numerous challenges, the kinds of challenges you would expect for a public school that is unblessed by private tuition dollars, but that is part of the education industrial complex. In the film, for example, the club almost fails to raise sufficient money to attend the major annual tournaments. So the crucial work of fundraising and advocating for district support represents distributed rhetorical activity, a la Jeff Grable, that is taken up by administrators, family, and other community members, all of whom contribute in ways far beyond what the education system requires of them. As a result, despite operating within an education system that is as preternaturally anti-flow as one can imagine, a system defined by extrinsic motivations tied to grades, test scores, and the increasingly illusory carrot of middle-class financial stability, not to mention all the standardization, the club somehow remains focused on the flow. So having conceptualized the IS 318 chess program as a flow cultivation milieu, I want now to consider the place of flow in community literacy. Obviously, the specifics are different. We are, after all, not playing chess, at least not literally. The outcomes of our work, particularly as they relate to activism and social change, are never as concrete as those defined by the end of a chess match. And although reflection has always been critical to community literacy, we can rarely retrace our steps to a specific move and say, well, that's where things started to go the wrong way. Nevertheless, I think we can productively ask ourselves the question, what would it mean to build engaged infrastructure that cultivated a flow milieu even while remaining connected to institutions that tend to disrupt it. Because I think for most of us, participation in community literacy also emerges from intrinsic motivations. We take on this work because we believe in it, not because we expect to make more money or to win awards, and certainly not because it makes our career paths easier. Participating in communities and networks of allies, disassociating our work as much as we can from the larger educational factory, and maladjusting to the status quo of a deeply unjust society. I think being part of these processes is the primary reward. So my dream of engaged infrastructure is that it would sustain and further cultivate the intrinsic motivations that bring faculty, students, and community partners to this work. Whether or not this involves establishing a new institution or adhering to informal networks, whether or not it involves making this conference a biennial event tied to a journal or book series, whether or not it involves courting philanthropic money, whether or not it involves creating titles, hierarchies, and bureaucratic procedures. Let us dream about how this infrastructure can cultivate flow. Indeed, as a colleague pointed out to me, the metaphor of flow extends beyond its cognitive benefits to the fluidity of engaged relationships and communities. So that is my dream, and in my remaining time, I want to step back to the discover phase, briefly narrating what you might call my flow-enriched origin story. More specifically, I want to describe the flow associated with our field's mentorship networks. That is, we may not exactly have our own infrastructure, even though all of our work is deeply tied to infrastructure. But something substantive, if more serendipitous than systematic, already exists among community literacy practitioners. These networks of relationships and ideas circulate through real people and the artifacts of their work. I'm talking about community partners, whether or not they attend conferences like this, and the scholars and students who do. And I'm talking about scholarship and the community publications that appear in local, national, and international venues, forums, and mediums. In my case, serendipitous mentorship has been the most important source of flow in my development as a scholar and citizen. This has included meeting and getting to know mentors, working actively with them, and exchanging ideas and stories. For example, in 2006, I found myself back in graduate school at the University of Michigan after a 2-year hiatus in which I had sworn off academia. This hiatus was bookended by bouts of frustrated idealism that had convinced me, to paraphrase a claim Homer Simpson once made about beer, that the academy is both the cause of and solution to all of society's major problems. Having abandoned my dissertation once, I was struggling to rediscover a community-oriented project within the limited time frame remaining before my funding would elapse. At this time, I met Linda Adler-Kastner, who was then at Eastern Michigan and who became a mentor after she attended Chalk and Cheese, which is the curiously named weekly forum for Michigan graduate students to share lunch and talk about field-relevant topics. I don't know if there's any Michigan people here right now, so you know what I'm talking about. Chalk and Cheese was the brainchild of Ann Geer, another key mentor who had patiently supported my vacillations about life in the academy. I periodically had flow-cultivating chats with Linda on the outskirts of Ann Arbor's Carytown district. And one day, she told me about Paula Matthews' book, Tactics of Hope. This book transformed my thinking about what it means to do community literacy, and as a result, it also transformed my dissertation. So one day, Linda advised me to contact Paula because, to put it simply, Paula is awesome. And so I did. My only intention in emailing her was to tell her how much I loved her book and how influential it had been, but she wrote back volunteering to serve on my dissertation committee. Needless to say, I jumped at the opportunity. And in telling you this, I'm not trying to volunteer Paula to serve on more people's dissertation committees. But I think it is worthwhile for all of us who are in a position to do so to consider taking on such roles or something along those lines with students beyond our home institutions. Turning these serendipitous interinstitutional experiences of wise mentorship into something more reliable is one example of how engaged infrastructure could cultivate a flow milieu. Other mentors include Steve Parks and Eli Goldblatt, both of whom I met at conferences after being captivated by their robust and multifaceted efforts to promote community change. And then there are my South Florida majes, Alex Salinas and Carlos Gonzalez, two Miami-Dade College professors who welcomed me into the Imagination Federation, a nexus of local, national, and international community partnerships that deeply shaped both the content and goals of my book, Collaborative Imagination. This was at a time just after I had moved to South Florida, a self-proclaimed community literacy practitioner on the tenure clock with no Miami community ties to speak of. My interactions with Alex and Carlos helped lead me to the Algebra Project, which was created in the early 1980s by civil rights leader Bob Moses. And I've also had the good fortune to meet and learn from Bob, whose resolute focus on organizers building roots within neighborhoods and empowering community members to become their own leaders deeply shaped my thinking about how community scholarship might be connected to community organizing. And his efforts to help young people use mathematics as a force for social change inspired my thinking about how people in our field might use rhetoric to do the same, or what I call the Rhetoric Project. While I tend to think of mentorship in face-to-face terms, I think it is important to recognize how people whom I have never met or have only been introduced to briefly have also cultivated flow. This mentorship is the collective legacy of community literacy scholarship. I have been influenced by many sources here, including Paula's insistence that relationships must precede projects, Steve's vision of the vernacular university, Eli's conception of joint sponsorship, Kirk Branch's educational literacy practices that are always pointing to the world that ought to be, and Ellen Cushman's rejecting false consciousness. In some sense, each one of these encounters was made possible by the previous one, which reminds me how the intertextuality of scholarship and the internetworking of people are themselves further interlaced. And of course, so many of the people I have mentioned have enriched each other's work as initial contacts evolved into relationships that tap into, shape, and are themselves shaped by the interinstitutional, interdisciplinary, and intergenerational networks of community engagement and activism. So you see, flow is all over the place in our work. And I want to pause for a quick aside geared mostly towards students here. In charting my development as a community literacy practitioner, I have emphasized the role of serendipitous mentorship. But I want to quote from my colleague, Vanessa Sohan, who offered a more proactive interpretation of this process. She said, "Part of your success in such serendipitous encounters comes from your own passion for your own projects and how they have been informed by the work of these mentors. Give yourself some credit." But part of the reason they responded was that they were engaged in what you had to bring offer and saw that work as building and improving on their own. In fact, I do give myself credit for priming serendipity, so to speak. I have consistently reached out to people whose work I admire, which is not an easy task for an introvert like myself. And a number of them have responded with wise mentorship. So to some extent, we can facilitate the emergence of pleasant surprises, though I don't know whether we can engineer them. And as importantly, when you have so many conscientious, diligent, and vibrant people doing this kind of work, a certain number of pleasant surprises are inevitable, though exactly when and how they might occur remains unpredictable. And let us be thankful for this, because in an academic system that still undervalues community-based scholarship, even as it embraces the buzzword of engagement, serendipity must remain an important part of this process, whether or not we build engaged infrastructure. And in my dream, facilitating conditions for serendipity would be a primary purpose of this engaged infrastructure. So as I conclude, I leave you not with a set of questions, but a set of aspirations. I hope we indulge our idealistic, visionary sides, playing community literacy's version of the believing game before we get caught up in the necessary frustrations of the doubting game. Again, I do not wish to curb our critical instincts or to stop us asking tough questions. Appreciative inquiry is, after all, a process of inquiry. But practicing it asks us to adjust how we inquire. So I hope we discover what galvanizes us, hearing the contributions of as many people as possible, both inside and outside the official times and spaces of this conference. And as we reflect on these stories, I hope we dream about what it would look like to create an infrastructure that maximizes such experiences for as many people as possible, both those inside the infrastructure and those connected from the outside. I hope we envision how we can further support the interinstitutional networks that already exist, while also facilitating new connections across these networks. I hope we are even more energized as we depart than we were when we arrived. And as best as we are able, I hope we cultivate flow together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul, for a great talk. I guess my question is about the relationship between these serendipitous moments and mentorship and institution building, and whether they're mutually exclusive or whether they're opposed to one another, because you seem to suggest that we embrace one or the other and we can't have both. And it begins to remind me a little bit of the line from Frederick Douglass's narrative, Writing in the Spaces Left. I feel like we're being pushed out of institutions. We're certainly being pushed out of the academy, being pushed out of public education. And so how do we write? Are we just going to write in the spaces left? Or are institutions really necessary, including higher education, which you said, like it could be, both the thing that, I don't know that I agree completely that it could be the saving grace, or the thing that destroys us, but it's important, and many other sectors. So how do we reclaim institutions so that they work for us, higher education, our economic system, all of those things, at the same time that we enjoy those surprises?
It's a great question. I don't know if I can offer a definitive answer to it. I was going to mention that Jeff Grable, part of his work has been to question the distinctions between communities and institutions, and to say that communities are a lot more like institutions than we tend to think, and institutions could be more like communities than we tend to think. To some extent, it's up to us to make that happen. And to me, it's about storytelling. It's preserving a place for storytelling in the work that we do. Because I think what happens with institutions is that what started as a purpose, a reason for doing something in a particular way, a solution to an issue that caused the institution to sprout up, it ends up becoming a series of procedures to follow. And the people who are making the institution run are disassociated from those initial stories. They don't know what the stories were, so they're doing it because they have to, or because they were told they have to, or just the inertia that tends to build in institutions. If we can keep or reclaim that place for storytelling, to remind ourselves why are we here, then I think there is a place for reclaiming institutions, making them do what we want them to do. I think it's absolutely adamant that we don't lose sight of that storytelling opportunity. And I know that's one of the things I liked about the depreciative inquiry idea, is that it's all about storytelling, but it's storytelling from a more positive place than the way we usually tell stories.
Sorry, I thought I was too loud anyway. My hearing aids are down low, that's right. My question is, how do you think graduate education in composition and rhetoric could change to to follow your flow, if you will?
Well, clearly something is going on that is causing so many people to choose this path. So I think something is being done well in these programs. But then the question is, what happens to people after they finish their programs? In my case, I was in a program where community engagement wasn't necessarily a priority. I kind of stumbled into it. And as a result, I had to find mentors outside my home institution. And I consider myself very lucky that happened. And I don't think it's happening with everybody. And so people are putting themselves, unfortunately, in difficult situations. And so it would be great if every graduate program had a community literacy-focused person, but are there ways in which the people who have already established a flag post and have tenure, but don't have access to all the other students who want to do this work in institutions that don't have that kind of mentorship, can we be the ones to build that mentorship? I mean, that's really the answer I can come up with. I mean, maybe there will be more hiring of community literacy practitioners in departments in different places. But I mean, I'm not seeing that in the job ads myself. I see a lot of professional writing, which could be made into community literacy, but I don't think it's an automatic thing.
So I'm not sure if this is a question or a statement. I know Paul and I have had long conversations about serendipity and institutions, but going back to your question about the margins, and being pushed out. For some people, they've lived all their life in the margins. And when you live in the margins, you realize that the margins are sometimes really interesting. And they are the crawl spaces which allow us to exist. And that infrastructure and institutions are often giant barriers. And if we look around the room, I know that, a lot of people are not fully represented in this group in terms of minority communities. And for me, that's a reminder of the barriers of the institutions. And that for some people who live more on the margins, institutions are not all that great, and maybe part of it for those of us who are there is that we don't want to pour our lives into an institution and the end is going to eat us up and spit us out. And I think sometimes for young people and younger people, as they're looking at the academy and it looks so enticing, maybe it's time to sort of like say what it is, that these are self-serving entities that, exist, for forever, for themselves, and not for the students, and most definitely not for the community that they exist in. And they're more like sucking vampires, as Bob Marley would say in Babylon System, that are basically indoctrinating people to support it, but really giving very little back. And I don't know. And so I think the margins, maybe how do we build the margins? It's like, how do we celebrate margins and maybe make margins that are actually really fun to explore and to write and to occupy and to embrace and to celebrate. And I don't know if I want to in completely, because maybe I want out, and maybe I am out already. So what's the point of going in? Anyway.
Do you want me to add something to that?
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk tremendously. But a question that arose for me while you were talking, and also I think partly in response to the last comment, is if we're trying to think of forms of community building and collective imagination that aren't already sort of circumscribed within the institution as it stands, are there places outside of education or outside of higher education specifically that we can look toward for models? I was just, names that were sort of running through my head as you were talking were, well, what if you were to organize higher education in the way that the Industrial Areas Federation came into existence, or if you thought of school like a Catholic worker house instead of a public institution. Where outside of the sphere of education can we look for examples to use, again, to build imaginatively?
I mean, I think there are models out there that we can look to. I mean, one is Carlos introduced me to Unitierra in Oaxaca, Mexico. I don't think I'm pronouncing that properly, but the idea is to build a university that has no institutional structure, that doesn't certify people, that's not accredited, but that solves real problems in communities. And I have always found Highlander in Tennessee to be a wonderful model that was so instrumental in the labor movement in the 30s and 40s and the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. They didn't give diplomas and they weren't accredited, but they had a major role to play as an institution of education. Now when I talk about bringing Highlander into classrooms, people tell me it doesn't work because of the same issues, I guess. I think it's possible to push on that a little bit. And to some extent, we say it's easier to do that kind of work outside of an institution because they don't have the same institutional constraints. But the people doing this work were often risking their lives in ways that we are not asked to do. So I'm not sure that it's actually easier for them. I think it's actually easier for us to a large extent. So how can we learn from these institutions that reject giving grades and diplomas and certification, but still educate people in really powerful ways into the classroom? The answer to me is to engage people's intrinsic motivations. The challenge there is our students have been enculturated into this system, not of their own making, not their fault, that has made them focus on intrinsic motivations so much, and it has made all of us focus on our extrinsic motivations so much. So we have to strategize to find ways to tap into the things that make people get up in the morning and want to do this kind of work, the stuff that brings joy and excitement. And how can we bring that into our classrooms? We cannot maybe completely annihilate the system as it is and reform it entirely, but we certainly can push against those constraints. And that's one reason why I want to spend my time here the next couple of days hearing people's stories of joy and inspiration and energy. And then we think about how we can maximize those experiences going forward.
So you might have already answered part of this question. But what I was thinking about when you were talking about mentorships and the many academics who have mentored you and flow is that a lot of the places where I feel that flow is in my partnerships with the community organizations and the community leaders. And that's where I fill up, right? And I'm also thinking of an article by David Coogan, and I'm forgetting the phrase that he was using, but talking about how his students going into the community are taken in and brought over to a new understanding by the community activists there. So I'm curious to hear stories about those kinds of mentorships and how do we build on them without, outsourcing this sort of learning onto people who already have lives to save and other important work.
Yeah, I mean, the community partner mentorship has been at least as important as anything else. And the dedication to my book is to my parents and to a man named Ken Watson, who's a guidance counselor, a college counselor in Detroit high schools. That is the subject of one of the chapters in my book. And I got to know him when I returned to graduate school and was trying to get involved in the community. And he's just a force of nature, I think, trying to turn a school in a dysfunctional community that is sending kids to prison rather than college, and to do his part to prevent that from happening. The tragedy of his situation is that he didn't have allies to work with, and he had so much knowledge to give. He's retired now, but we could have learned a hell of a lot from him, and most of us didn't have that opportunity. Because, and Steve has written about this a lot, that community intellectuals don't get validated as community intellectuals within the academy. And that's something that would have to change. I don't know what that would look like. Maybe that's something that we can figure out together when we talk about our stories of people like Ken Watson over the next couple of days. How can we envision a way to recognize that so that all of us can learn from it?
I want to come back to the Highlander example. I had the privilege of working with folks at the Highlander Research and Education Center in Tennessee, and I want to try out the possibility of accepting and deeply respecting their lack of desire to be in conventional academic spaces here with us, because my experience was it was very distinct from their desire to work with and their sense of where their expertise and possibility and responsibility happened to be, and where there were possible bridges for us. And I also think about Shirley Bryce Heath and her work with places like Boys and Girls Clubs, and her adamance that there's no reason why academic institutions should try to be like or want them to be like, right? That usefulness of our differences and our different orientations and situations might be really, really important to doing many of the things that we're talking about. And that's not to say that there aren't things internal to each type of institution that need fixed, right? But there's something about our differences that feels powerful to me about coming together here to the degree that we're able to do that, or elsewhere. And so I guess I want to throw a desire for caution in when, where, and why we want to remake ourselves like our best partners, and maybe think about when, where, and why we need to make ourselves better, but be like ourselves so we can be partners with others. So I'll just offer that.
I think this builds off your comment a little bit, and I hope Paul can address it. I'm John Warnock from the University of Arizona. I think when we are in institutions, as most of us here are, we do have to be aware, acutely aware, that we are inside. As long as we're picking up that check, we are serving the purposes of the institution. And I think it's easy, though, to give the institutions too much credit. I think Jeff Grable has done some very good work to show us how we can begin to look inside of institutions, to map them, and to look for openings inside the institutions and to work with their own purposes. Paul, you used the word engagement, and as I recall, you used it in a way that suggested they don't mean by that what we mean by it. And I think that's true. On the other hand, it's there. And it's something that we can use. There's a scholar named James Boyd Wright from the University of Michigan who's talked about the fact that the U.S. Constitution is filled with things that could allow the founders to be charged with hypocrisy. But on the other hand, it was still there, and it kept operating, and it kept moving, and finally certain things, some things, moved in a very good direction. So I think if we're going to be in institutions, let's face up to the fact, and then let's try to make things inconvenient for it. Maybe that's one of the gifts of postmodernism. It shows us how we can do that in all sorts of things that look stable and not give them too much credit.
Well, I mean, I agree with you, and Bob Moses has a wonderful phrase. He says, sometimes you have to sneak onto the plantation. And he talks about how the 1957 Civil Rights Act, which before the one that we usually remember, was a very flawed act in a lot of ways, but that it created opportunities because ostensibly civil rights workers had recourse to demand support when they were putting themselves in dangerous situations. And he says that was a way to use a flawed act to create opportunities that weren't there before. So you're right, because it's there, we should make use of it as much as we can. He has another phrase calling working the crawl spaces, where, again, you're in the institution, but in ways that, to some extent, you have autonomy over, you control. And another phrase that I love, that I've used a lot, is the concept of creative maladjustment, just from an essay by Herbert Cole. He took the phrase from Martin Luther King, and it's about how in society we're expected to adjust to things, to adjust to the status quo, but when the status quo itself is deeply unjust, we need to maladjust to it. But how do we maladjust to it? How do we maladjust to it in an intelligent way so that the people who are overseeing us, who are surveilling us, don't see us and don't get us in trouble for it? And so creative maladjustment is a way of intelligently resisting the status quo, so you stay in alignment with your goals and values and do the kinds of things you want to do, and you find spaces to connect with allies, but without raising red flags among your superiors. I think we have to figure out how to do that.
Paul Feigenbaum, thank you so much.